Hello everyone and welcome to this live stream event featuring three highly experienced journalists, all nominees for our International Journalist of the Year award. My name is Samir Shah and I'm the chair of One World Media. This session is our 32nd annual awards, which recognizes the very best media coverage of developing countries. This year, given the unusual circumstances we're in, we're pleased to bring the OWM Awards online. Of course, it's not quite the same thing as a physical event, but on the other hand, we now have the potential to reach a much wider audience online. You can all find more details of the other events taking place today in the description below. Now, for this discussion, I am absolutely delighted to welcome our three nominees for International Journalist of the Year. They are Alex Crawford from Sky News, nominated for her work reporting on attacks on hospitals in Italy. Fisayo Soyombo from The Cable, nominated for his undercover investigation on corruption in the Nigerian criminal justice system. And John Sudworth from the BBC, nominated for his reports inside the Uyghur camps in China. Welcome, all of you. I'd like to begin with, before we get into your stories, I'd like to begin to ask you about what drew you to the kind of journalism you all do. And I want to start with Fisayo. And I was reading somewhere, Fisayo, that you said journalism is as much a calling as it is a profession. What were you getting at with that?
More of a calling than a profession, in the sense that as a journalist, you're a custodian of public interest. You know, your job is a special one that doesn't allow you to always place your pocket above your responsibility. So as much as you want to live a good life, you want to be able to afford certain education for your children, you have a certain standard of life you aspire to. The reality is that if you have to do your job really good, then the public interest must always be the overriding factor in your decision making. So you live for public good, you live for societal advancement, and a lot of times there would be a clash between that responsibility and your financial interests.
And when did this, using your own word, calling come to you? Was it straight away? Or, I mean, when did you realize this is what you wanted to do?
It started from uni, you know. Ironically, I studied animal science. You know, I left school with a BSc in animal science. I spent years learning how to raise cattle, sheep, and goat. And I did that across 2 universities for 7 years. But while in school, I joined the campus press, and I saw that we could use journalism to advance the rights of students. I saw it work on campus, and I thought, why not? Why not do this in the larger society after school? It was a conscious decision, you know, because it wasn't my line of study at the start, but I saw it work, and then I just wanted to expand it on a larger scale.
Alex, tell me how you saw this profession and how did you get into what you're now doing?
Well, I was brought up in Africa. I was at school in Zimbabwe during the fight for independence at that stage. The only people that were allowed to cross over from Zambia, where I lived, into Zimbabwe were the school children who were being educated. So I saw quite a lot of struggles, you know, going on in the background all around me as I was growing up. And I realized that journalists had quite a huge voice, a very big voice. And that pretty much, that was all I ever wanted to do. I started the school newspaper when I came to Britain for my later education. And I always felt very different and always felt a little bit of a rebel. And very soon, at whatever level you're at, like even on my training weekly newspaper, I realized that journalists had a huge responsibility. In those days, it was spreading the news because you didn't have social media and you didn't have the internet, but also to be questioning and to be challenging and to be giving a voice to people who otherwise actually didn't have a voice. And even from those very small beginnings, I mean, we had a readership of 13,000. It was a weekly newspaper. It had tremendous impact within its very small community. And I feel like I'm just doing the same job, but just on a bigger scale. And of course, the bigger the scale, the bigger the responsibility and the bigger the voice you have. And that is incredibly scary, but it's also a sort of massive responsibility and aspiration. And I feel very, very lucky, especially given the job that I do. I feel incredibly lucky to be in this position, and I feel it's a massive responsibility. And I know many foreign correspondents feel that way. You know, they realize they're in an incredible position to get to places, to talk to people that diplomats, politicians, ordinary people, most other sections of society don't ever get the chance to do it and to get to those places. And therefore it's an incredible privilege. It's massively exciting, but also quite frightening.
Thank you. John, you're of course now reporting in an enormously important country. Tell me about your own entry into this journalism and how you got into it. And, tell us what you did.
Yeah, thank you, Samir. And first of all, I mean, it's a real pleasure to join you all, especially Alex and Fisayo, journalists whose work I admire enormously. I think, Alex, I last saw you on a burning barricade in Hong Kong at some point last year.
It was great to see you too. I remember you being really friendly, and I think there is a real camaraderie between people who are doing these sort of stories.
That's interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, of course, there's competition amongst journalists, but I think Alex is exactly right. In the field, at least, it is often an experience marked more by collaboration and camaraderie, which is a wonderful side of it. But I think for Fisayo, you hit the nail on the head, really. I mean, you don't do this for the paycheck. I think there are few journalists, who make their fortunes doing this kind of stuff.
Feeling, John.
Yeah. Well, so there must be another reason, right? And I mean, I kind of fell into it. I was drawn to journalism. I grew up in the UK in the 80s, very ordinary background. It was a time of huge social upheaval. My parents were interested in the news. I grew up, with parents who read papers and listened to BBC radio. So for me, I think it was always there as sort of an important part of my background. And yes, I think through university, interested in those aspects of extracurricular life, and drawn into it that way, really. But you asked me, Samir, about China and being here, and I think to echo what's already been said, really. For me, the more I've done it, and particularly the more immersed I've got in the foreign field, the more I realise what a privilege it is. I am living and working in a country where it goes without saying, Chinese nationals, many of whom do some extraordinary and brave journalism, despite the constraints, do not have the latitude and the privilege that I have as the holder of a foreign passport. And I think, some of the journalism I've done here, I'm acutely aware would be impossible to do for a Chinese national. And that, of course, makes it all the more important to get it right, all the more important to find those stories that can't be told any other way.
Thank you. John, I just, before we go on to the stories themselves, a lot of people watching this, aspiring journalists who want to do the kind of work you did, and have watched what the reports that are now being nominated, which are amazing. And I wonder what you all feel are the qualities needed to deliver that kind of journalism. So what should aspiring journalists be looking into themselves for and asking themselves, do they have these qualities? Because you three have done some most extraordinary reporting. So tell me what you think the qualities are that make you a really good journalist of the sort you guys are.
Sorry, was that?
Yeah, John, you start, and then Alex and Fisayo join in.
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, I suppose, you know, broadcast journalism is a different sort of thing. And if you go back to the days when I began, as Alex mentioned, you know, before the internet, actually before mobile phones, I still remember being at BBC Southwest, my very first posting with the BBC in the Plymouth newsroom, and there were 3 mobile phones between the lot of us. And if you went out on a story, you had to sign your name on a board with the mobile phone you'd taken. And of course, it didn't matter anyway, because it was most of the time you disappeared into the wilderness of rural Devon, and there was no phone signal anyway. I mean, that's how where I began my journalism. And you know, so broadcast journalism was a very different sort of thing back then, I think it's fair to say. And in some ways it was easier because broadcast...
What kind of person were you? I want to get at what kind of qualities you had.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think, you know, in those days, you know, I guess, you know, being on telly was much more of a special thing. It drew people who wanted to be on TV. You know, and for, you know, not to suggest that's a negative thing at all. We now live in an age where everybody's on TV.
Yes.
The broadcasters have lost their monopoly. Just being at an event isn't enough. You know, it is not any longer good enough just to see this as a presentational skill. And I think broadcasters, for all the good reasons, have had to learn now to compete in the story finding and the storytelling in a way that perhaps we didn't used to have quite as much.
Yeah, the broadcasting is like. Fisayo, of course, yours was a written thing, and I read your pieces, and I don't think many people would be able to have the kind of strength and qualities that you possess to carry out your journalism. I mean, tell me what you think are the qualities needed to do the kind of work you do.
Thank you. I really do think that it is okay for people to see the bright side of journalism. For younger journalists in Nigeria, for instance, to see Fisayo Soyombo on the shortlist for the One World Media Award and want to do the same. You know, journalism, especially when it gets to a point where your work is being recognized, brings you out. There's some sort of popularity that people, you know, you aspire to, and it's not bad, as John said, but they have to see the other side too. And for me, the most important thing is readiness to give up everything. Someone who wants to do good investigative journalism must be ready to give everything. And when I say everything, I'm not necessarily talking about life. I give an example. A few weeks ago, I was trying to do some COVID-19 related story back in Nigeria, and I needed access. And the authority said, no, not to me, but my findings were that they thought that radical journalist who went to prison undercover, who went to a psychiatric hospital undercover, we are not going to allow him access because he's going to write something negative, even though that was meant to be a positive story celebrating the good works of healthcare workers fighting this pandemic in Nigeria. So you have to be ready to give up everything. You have to be ready to give up more stories, some stories that you want to do that you are no longer able to. You have to love this job enough to be able to give up your life for it if it gets to that point. Because you're not going to pretend that everybody likes you. A lot of people like you, but so many others don't. And they wouldn't mind taking you out if they got the opportunity. So you have to ask yourself, the cost that I live for with journalism, is it worth, can I take everything for it? You know, you have to be dogged. You have to be resilient. You can't be doing investigative reporting and think you can take notes. No, you have to be mentally ready to submit everything else and focus on the work. A lot of times I'm at places of interest and I get back to my location and I'm writing the things I saw, and my friends wonder how did you manage to do that? You didn't write, but it's a training. You know, I understand that you have to be prepared to store as much information in your brain as possible. You have to be able to use your eyes to store information as well. Observe. It's a lot of things are involved, but then it's passion, it's hard work, it's mental preparedness, it's willingness to go the long haul, it's interest in doing it without necessarily expecting gratification, to do journalism without expecting awards, even though it doesn't mean they won't come if it is well done, but to do it to be ready to do it for the public. I think that's the biggest factor.
That's very interesting. Alex, last year when you won an award, your colleague referred back to you and said it wouldn't have happened but for your, and I'm going to quote, your drive, passion, and your desire to seek truth, which is getting at some of the qualities that Fisayo was talking about. Can you tell me what you think?
I loved hearing. Yeah, I loved hearing you say that, because he encapsulated so much of what I think we all feel. It's if you're deluded by fame or fortune, it's not going to work. It's about commitment. It's about 100% commitment, because there are going to be so many sacrifices. There are going to be giving up many times with your family, maybe giving up your family entirely, giving up freedom, giving up popularity, because you are going to be very unpopular. You're going to be very, very unpopular. And now in the internet age, you're going to attract all sorts of criticism and trolls and internet attacks. It's not pretty. It's sometimes you're living badly, eating badly, sleeping badly. You have to be so passionate and so committed to what you're doing and believe in it so much. You really need to believe in it, because if you don't believe it, you're running a huge marathon and you're going to fall at the first challenge. And so you have to believe in it. And I think every story, certainly that I do, and I bet it's the same with these two other guys, because I see their journalism and it's the same passion and it's the same commitment. I mean, working in Nigeria and China, I cannot imagine how difficult that is. Well, I know Nigeria is very difficult to work in, very, very difficult. So I know the other two have gone through the same thing. You have to really believe in your subject. You have to really feel that you've got something to investigate. And you know that from your journalistic instinct. You know, I knew that there were hospitals being bombed by the regime in Syria. I just needed to get that evidence. And those few words flung out there seemed so easy. It involved months and weeks and a lot of sweat and a lot of blood by many other people to get to the point. And actually, even after you gather the evidence, it may not actually go anywhere, which is why someone like One World Media highlighting subjects like this gives it a whole new life. You know, winning the award is an incredible honor, but just highlighting the issues are so important, so important. It's necessary. And actually, you know, in a field where money is so difficult, where all news organizations are finding it very difficult economically, journalists being attacked.
We'll come to all that later on. I think that's, you know, the things that all three of you talked about just there, I think, you know, it may well scare off a few people who are watching this and think, well, maybe that's not for me. But it comes through incredibly in the stories that have now been nominated. So what I'd like to move on to now are those stories. And just for the benefit of those viewers who don't know what it is, I'd ask all three of you just to very briefly tell us the story that's been entered, and just a summary. So when we go through the conversation, they're aware of what it is. So I wonder if, John, you could just tell us a bit about what that's the Uyghur story in China that you covered has been entered. And then I'll go to the other two.
So yes, of course, with pleasure. We've been doing, as have a lot of media based here in China, a lot of work on the situation in the western region of Xinjiang over the past 2 years. It's always been an area of interest, but from 2-3 years ago, of course, there began to be these reports that large numbers of the Muslim minority there, mainly the Uyghur Muslim minority, but others as well, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, members of a essentially mainly Muslim faith in that region were being incarcerated in large numbers, basically as because of a perceived threat that they pose to China's view of itself as a unified state with a singular communist identity and ideology. We began to report on that. As I said, that's been a rolling program with a lot of effort, a huge amount of resources for which we're extremely lucky to work for, organizations that give us the kind of backing to do this work. And the story that we did, the most recent one, was one about the impact of the policies in Xinjiang on the separated families. This is very difficult work because, of course, the Chinese authorities are very, very keen to hide what's going on in that part of the world. So to do it and to build up the evidence, journalists can travel there, which we've done on a number of occasions, but we are heavily monitored, tailed, blocked, prevented from really anything that you would consider proper access. But we try anyway, and there's always some stuff we gather as part of it. But of course, the other big dimension is looking for testimony, and by focusing on that issue of the divided families, picking up interviews with family members overseas in Turkey and Kazakhstan in particular, where many of these, the Uyghur diaspora has fled to whilst this large persecution is going on, and trying to paint as accurate and as truthful a picture as we could, given those challenges about the situation.
John, thank you very much. Fisayo, tell the audience a little bit about the story that's your story that's been nominated.
Yeah, it's a 3-part series into the Nigerian criminal justice system. It's a story that developed over time. The original idea was that there was a lot of corruption going on in prison, and then just like Alex said, knowing that something was happening, but then waiting for the evidence. So I had that knowledge in 2017, partly because of the kind of job I was doing. I was the editor of a paper at that time. I couldn't leave, but eventually in 2019, I turned myself into the police. I disguised my looks. I had dreads on. The Nigerian police is notorious for picking up random guys for filmsy reasons. Why are you wearing dreads? Why are you doing this to your hair? Why are you dressed in crazy jeans? So I just took up that identity, and I was arrested. And I thought that I would be charged to court within 48 hours by law. The law in Nigeria is that if a court is within 40-kilometer radius of that police station, you are charged in 24 hours. If it's more than 40 kilometers, you are charged in 48 hours. So I went to police station as a means of getting to prison. But I got to the police station, they wanted bribes. 1 day, they didn't let me go. 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. And it was quite traumatizing because you had a space of roughly 60 meters by 16 meters to yourself, no one to talk to. You had to pay bribes if you wanted to eat. You had to pay bribes if you wanted to have your bath. You had to pay bribes if you wanted to charge your phone. So I thought, wow, it's not even the prison alone. This is a big story concerning Nigerian police. So on the 5th day, because I refused to pay bribes to be freed, on the 5th day, I was charged to court. And right there in court, prison warders, were trying to extort me. And I found out right there, even before I got to court, that if you had money, good money, you wouldn't suffer in prison. They told me, the officials told me, if you have money, you're not going to suffer in Nigerian prison. And then I got to prison.
Just to interrupt, so you were undercover and experiencing the criminal justice system from the inside, and that from the inside.
Yes,
and
I wanted to live it. I wanted to live it like.
That was very, very interesting. Alex, just tell us a little about your story in Idlib. You'd begun a bit, but just tell us a little bit more about the entry that you've had.
I will. First of all, massive respect to John and Fisayo. Incredible stories, both of them. Our story focused on multiple bombings in 1 day in Idlib province in Syria. There were 4 on the morning of July 22nd, 2019. And whilst I've covered the ongoing developments in Syria for 9 years and covered many hospital strikes over many, many years by different factions, it was proving very difficult to build up evidence about the regime and their Iranian and Russian backers being involved in hospital strikes, which, as you know, are an international war crime. So we decided to focus on one particular, this was one of the worst attacks in recent times. There were 44 people killed and more than 70 people wounded. I had a network of people helping me on the ground, and I found myself and my crew in a peculiarly unique position of being one of maybe 3 or 4 foreign journalists who were able to get into Idlib at that period. Still, actually, at the moment, it's phenomenally difficult to get inside. And it didn't matter the amount of evidence, pictorial evidence that we were getting from people on the ground, they just were not being believed. So we went in multiple times, but we actually got hold of cockpit audio recordings, which had the Russian pilots talking about dropping the bombs, which they called candy. And we built up this picture on this one period of time and showed, we asked the Russian Defense Ministry for their reaction. They denied it had even happened and actually gave a news conference showing the area and how the market had not been bombed. We went and visited the market several times and brought back our evidence brought back visual eyewitness, and I brought back hospital documents showing that these hospitals had been attacked. And the UN picked it up and saw that it was obviously the denials were meaningless.
Thank you very much. For those of you who haven't seen, I do recommend and encourage you to look at the 3 entries. They are amazing pieces of journalism, really fantastic. And I do congratulate all 3 of you for what you've done. I just want to pull out some common themes here and talk a little bit about those themes. The first is about access. How did you get into where you've got into? Secondly, about safety, your safety, the safety of your teams, the safety of the people you interviewed, and finally, your recovery, because all of you go through some very, very difficult situations. You see things, and I wonder how you cope with it when it's done. So let's go through it. I'm conscious of time, so I'd really like to hear your thoughts on all this, but let's try and see if you get, otherwise, my OWM will tell me you went on for far too long. So let's go. But let's begin with access. And John, getting access, I mean, how difficult was it, and what you touched upon it a bit, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough. I mean, these are all of the issues you've mentioned there are really difficult and fraught issues. I mean, in terms of the reporting in Xinjiang, technically, foreign journalists who have the necessary press credentials in China are free to travel to Xinjiang. But of course, in practice, the reception you get there makes the sort of work we can do anything but free. Constant tailing, constant monitoring, being stopped, being questioned, occasionally detained, request from the police to delete our material, a constant negotiation, and all the time trying to keep in the back of your mind that it's that difficult balance always between sort of persistence and restraint, knowing that knowing when to push, when not to push. So it's tough. And then, as you say, we are accompanied, of course, because you can't operate without the assistance of our local staff, who are extraordinary, both in terms of their bravery and in terms of the quality of the journalism that they bring. But there's a responsibility there as well. And these are very, very difficult issues. In the end...
Can I ask, in terms of the conditions, I don't think it was in these reports, but I read somewhere that they actually forced you to confession. Is that right? Yes,
that was a different report. That was a couple of years ago, a trip to a Chinese province where we were trying to interview a petitioner who was wanting to come to Beijing. We were going to follow her footsteps all the way to Beijing. She had a number of issues she was complaining about, and we hoped that by following her story we could reveal something of this sense of a lack of justice at the heart of Chinese society. And in the end, we were yes, forced to sign this this confession.
What would have happened to you if you hadn't? If you said, "I'm not going to do it"?
Well, we had a rather a sort of difficult discussion amongst us as a team about what we ought to do in that situation, and for various reasons, mainly to do with the considerations of safety, we felt that as it was the ticket out of there, it was the right thing to do.
Well, let's come on to safety. I think Fisayo, your access was slightly different, isn't it? You weren't waiting for some kind of official permission. You just went in there. Why? Tell me a bit about that. How you got in?
It's always about frustration by the authorities. I never set out to do undercover journalism. As a matter of fact, I never set out to do investigative journalism. I just wanted to do good journalism, and I saw if it's a certain kind, then it becomes investigative. So you have authorities always denying you access. You write to a simple access to your hospital. The chief medical director tells you, write the state government. The state government tells you, write the PAMSEC. The PAMSEC tells you, write the health. And you're just like, you get out of the way. I'm just going to go in like a regular member of the society. That's how it happened. It's not exactly undercover in the sense of undercover. It's just experiencing things like every member of the society. Because in Nigeria, it's not going to work. The official access is never going to come, especially when there's something to hide that you need to expose for the benefit of the public. So in most cases, I'm just looking to access places, not as a journalist, like a regular member of the society. And that's why a lot of times when I do my stories, the public easily identify with them because they've been in my shoes before.
That's very interesting. Alex, you went into the most extraordinary circumstances, and just tell us a little about what you needed to do to get access to that. You were talking about the 4 hospitals, and you wanted the evidence.
I think there's all sorts of different levels of access. Getting into Idlib, into Syria, that an area of Syria which is controlled by multiple militia groups, is in itself a challenge. We did that because I built up a network of help over 9 years of covering it, and recently got a network of people helping me in Turkey as well. Once I got into the hospitals, it is the doctors and the nurses and the medics, that's very different, because they are absolutely desperate to tell their story, absolutely desperate to explain what had happened. And a lot of them are incredibly frustrated at the lack of international recognition or recognition abroad.
This process of talking to people who are desperate to tell their stories opens up this second area, which is about safety. You talk to people, you kind of maybe leave it, but then they're still there. So I'd like all of you to discuss how you think about safety, because you all work in really quite difficult areas. And it's just not, it's your safety, it's other safety. How does the issue of safety play in your head when you come and tell this story?
I mean, obviously safety is massive, absolutely critical, because you have to stay alive. You ideally have to stay in prison or avoid being taken hostage so that you can actually tell your story. So it's absolutely critical. It's definitely not easy. And I go in a very, very small team, because the smaller you are, the more able you are, the quicker you can be. And it doesn't mean you're going to avoid problems, because there will always be problems. There's always going to be issues of safety. And it's balancing the danger against what you're trying to get and trying to keep the risk down as much as possible. But you can't get rid of the risk entirely. There's always going to be a big level of risk. And it's a huge headache for instance, my editors, who are on tenterhooks the entire time that we're away and doing it.
I can imagine. John, how do you strike that balance?
Well, I mean, of course, the considerations are different. You know, I've nothing but admiration for what Alex does, not just in that story, but in a lot of the work that I've seen. I mean, thankfully, in China, it is rarely an issue of, a critical issue of physical safety. Thankfully, nobody is shooting at me in China. But on the other hand, there are real issues to consider. We plan very carefully. We need to consider very carefully things like digital security, the sort of surveillance we might be under by the Chinese authorities, and what we need, and the issues that may present themselves, particularly for our, as I mentioned earlier, for our Chinese passport holding staff, where of course the calculation of risk may be different. Essentially constant discussion and planning and thinking as we go through the story, because once you get to somewhere like Xinjiang, where you're under that sort of scrutiny, the risks are constantly evolving, and I think it's just a question of having trust in a team. We have an absolute rule that we are all absolutely clear, and we constantly remind each and every one of the team in and amongst ourselves that a discussion of risk is vital to everything we do. So if somebody's uncomfortable and doesn't want to proceed beyond a certain point, it's one out, all out, essentially. And we've got to constantly sort of make sure that we're weighing up the risks as a team, rather than as, as individual journalists desperate to get the story.
That's very interesting. You both emphasize the team point. I think that's very good. Fisayo, two things: that you didn't work as a team, and you really did face physical violence, because you were beaten when you were in prison, were you not? So how did you process that? I mean, in terms of your own safety in this incredibly dangerous story you decided to tell.
First of all, I have to say that one of the undersides of investigative journalism is that there are certain questions you can't answer in specifics, and safety is one of them. But generally, I keep asking myself questions. Where do I live? Who visits me? Who has my number? When do I change my number? So it's a tough life in that sense, that you're always looking over your shoulder. You have to continue looking over your shoulder when you're writing a story, when you're planning a story, when you're not writing any story. You're wondering if someone thinks that's the best time to strike. So it's a tough one. But with specific regards to the present story, so before I went in, I went for tests, I spoke with doctors. When I got out, because I was beaten, my cover was blown, I had to see my doctor again. I had to spend time with a physiotherapist, so I'm always putting these support structures in place, because like Alex said the other time, no matter how careful you are, something is going to go wrong, and you have to be ready for it.
Honestly, I have to tell you, I am so full of admiration for what all you three do, and your colleagues in other areas. I sit there thinking, well, I'm sitting in my comfortable home without any pressure on me, but all of you go out there, you see terrible things, and you come back and you report it for us. Moving at a kind of human level, what are your coping mechanisms when you come out, having witnessed or, to say, experienced, really, really hard stuff? I'd like to know, just how do you humanly cope with it? Alex, how do you cope with what you see?
I think the most important thing in my life in being able to cope is my family. I mean, they're a very, very strong anchor, and I retreat into my hinterland, which is them. But I think you have to be aware that you're probably not going to be the same. You are just not going to be the same. You cannot see death on a big scale. You can't see people being killed, going through terrible things, lives destroyed. You can't keep on seeing that blood and bombing and bullets all the time without feeling and knowing and recognizing that you're going to be affected. You have to prepare yourself and keep on being emotionally, mentally, and physically strong, because it's all interlinked. You have to keep up a good level of physical fitness, but that goes in tune with the emotional and mental fitness, and you need to be aware of that. You need to know that every time you see that, it's like getting beaten up. It's just your head's getting scrambled. So you need to unscramble that and untie the huge spaghetti that you're you're going to turn into in your head unless you sort it out. And I find that a lot of physical activity does really help, definitely helps, but you can't replace having very close family, close partners, you know, close children, close friends, because that is also a big emotional prop.
That's very, John, as you said, it's not so much the physical violence, but the people you talk to have to live under this state, which can behave in all sorts of difficult ways to people who have contributed and helped you. How do you deal with that?
Yes, I mean, I think it does take its toll. I mean, our reporting on Xinjiang, meant that we were in contact with people who had suffered serious trauma, parents who were never going to see their children again. When we were taken into the camps, the official access we got from the Chinese government, I think for me, the experience of being in there and watching this sort of this very surreal sort of Potemkin-like scenario unfold in front of us, and being face to face with the people in those institutions had an enormous impact. I think some of what Alex said is absolutely right. I think you need, again, through talking amongst ourselves as a team and to family, that support is vital. For me, I think what really helps is the delivery of the report. I think the moment when you have published that truth in as honest and as accurate a way as you can, and done your due diligence as a journalist, and made it, made that truth sort of stand up and get noticed. For me, there's an enormous sort of psychological release in just being able to do that. And as to go back to what we said at the beginning, I mean, that is an enormous privilege to be able to be charged with telling these people's stories, and finally to be able to get them out there. And for me, I think that's what really helps.
That's very interesting. I mean, Fisayo, you had, as you know, you yourself went through quite a traumatic experience. How do you cope with it? Was it, as John says, the fact that you published it and people now know about the experience? How much did that help? And what other mechanisms do you use to cope with the kind of tough things you've endured?
Frankly, I consider myself extremely lucky to do what I do. Listen, I love journalism to bits. You know, my journey is quite unique. 7 years studying animal science when all I ever wanted to be was a journalist. And here I am. I'm actually a journalist when I could have wasted years away. So I view this job from a position of privilege. I always see my cup as half full rather than half empty. It helps me a lot. You know, that's one. Another is that I'm always in the middle of planning. While I'm on one story, I'm planning for the next. The moment I put that story out and it's out there, it's a mental shift to the next story. So the effect is minimal. And finally, I have a supportive cast of family and friends. I have a life outside journalism, outside the noise, the popularity, the attention that this job brings. I have a safe place that I go to every now and then, you know, to take myself out of public eye and out of the consequences of some of the things that I've seen.
It's so interesting. Honestly, I thought that what all you said is such an interesting insight into what it is to be the kind of journalism you guys do. But we're coming to the end. I can't believe it already. I want to just move on now, and touch on something that Alex, you kicked off with, which is about the pressures on this kind of journalism, the newsroom appetite for it, the budgets, and also, if I may ask, just, you know, what role does being part of the One World Media Awards, how important are they to help you, you know, carry out your job and, support what you do? Alex, you kicked off with it earlier at the beginning. Why don't you just talk a little bit more about it, and then I'll throw it to the other two.
So I think it's crucial when something like One World recognises it, because it highlights the whole issue. I mean, how many of us have been in positions where we're trying to persuade news editors or foreign editors to cover a story, and they say no one's really interested in Syria? or no one's that how on earth are you going to get the Uyghurs, and really, do we want to talk about Nigerian corrupt system right now when we've got COVID? We've all had those conversations. They can be very difficult ones when everyone's having to number crunch over what is more important and what should we do, and do we want to take on that level of risk. So recognition in any shape or form is absolutely critical, because it validates the story, it validates the issue, and that is crucial for those of us who are at the sharp end trying to do the stories. So that aside, I think it's incumbent on us as journalists to make whatever story we're doing interesting to other people. And if we can't make our editors interested, how on earth are we going to make ordinary viewers, people, readers interested in it? So that's part of the trick of being a journalist. If it is a trick, it's part of the skill, perhaps, of being a journalist, that you have to make people think it could be you inside that hospital in Idlib. It could be you having a bomb land randomly on your house. It could be you and your children having to run or not be able to get hospital facilities, or feeling that you're a doctor or you can't train to be a nurse because that puts a great big target on your back. If you can do that, you've probably cracked it.
Alex, thank you. John, so tell me again, from your point of view, what kind of pressures are there on the kind of journalism you do, and how important it is that well-run media and our awards, they support that?
Well, yeah, I mean, to echo Alex, I think it's vital. I think, Fisayo mentioned earlier, it's not about the awards as individuals, but I do think these awards help showcase the best in journalism. I think it reminds people of the variety of reporting that's out there, and I think it's vital for that reason. I mean, the pressures are all part of it. We live in a world where newsroom budgets are falling. You can see the crisis in local news reporting across the Western world in particular. I have colleagues here in the foreign media press pack in Beijing who are on their second posting, but first time round they might have been sent here with the Baltimore Sun or any one of a number of regional US newspapers that were once posting reporters to China. I mean, how distant does that now seem? So the pool is shrinking, and I think we all feel it. Budgets are shrinking. The internet is swallowing advertising revenue. The models are under real pressure. So I mean, really, the appeal for me is this stuff matters. Of course, it matters, and these awards help showcase the best of it, and hopefully remind people to pay for it. Get a subscription to the best of journalism being done out of China. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times. This stuff isn't free, and audiences should be reminded it really does matter.
Thank you, John. So how? What are the pressures on your kind of journalism, and how important and helpful is it that One World Media recognizes it and has these awards for great work in this area?
Pressures are that the funding is limited. Absolutely, funding is limited. Newspapers are asking why they have to. I mean, the funding is limited, and investigative reporting is quite cost intensive. So they are asking themselves, why do they want to pay that much for just one story or a series of stories that will cost you 3 months on the field, and then in 3 days people are done reading, So, but then to not have this kind of award, because we have to be realistic. We live in a vain world where people are judging journalists on things like, who are you? What medium are you linked with? What have you won? What audience do you have? And so to be shortlisted for the One World Media Award means that there's more attention on my work. There are people who didn't see my present story initially when it was published in October 2019, who have now gone back to the story, and then it helps to highlight to the public. It helps to strengthen your credibility, your integrity, your opportunity to be able to get funding for that kind of story next time, because they think it's a story with the potential to go as far as possible.
Fisayo, thank you. We've come to the end. Thank you, all three of you. It's been the most interesting conversation. I began full of admiration. I have even greater admiration for what you all do. Good luck very much. The winners will be announced at 1 p.m. The next talk will be at 6 p.m. An interview between Jon Snow and Rappler founder Maria Ressa. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Nice connecting with you, Alex and John.
Yes, definitely. So good to hear you both. I think that's the best thing about COVID-19, that we've actually had a chance to talk to each other and hear from you guys. It's been a real honor. Thank you. Guys. Thanks for organising it, One World.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure.